this week, again, we have several things to go through and several books to go through, but there's really not anything terribly crazy. So, and just for the record, next week, where we're doing 9 days, I've already kind of outlined all of it out, and so it's not really that much next week either, as far as it's not crazy. So we should go out fairly easily. All right, we're going to start with Philemon. So note that Onesimus is a runaway slave who has ended up converting to Christianity and working with Paul. Paul asked Philemon to forgive Onesimus and to allow him to come back to work with him, right? And so, again, remember, when we think about slavery in the New Testament, again, it's mostly what we would consider indentured slavery, right? Where you sell yourself into slavery so that you can survive. And so, but still, that doesn't mean that it was happy times, right? It was still harsh work, and you certainly had cruel masters and such. We don't really know the situation here. We just know that Onesimus has left, right? He took off. Note that Paul argues that if Onesimus had not run away, then he would not have converted to Christianity, right? So at Philemon 15 through 16, which of course, note that it's only one chapter, right? So it's just verses. He says, "For this perhaps is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord," right? So look, yes, he ran away, but now he's become a brother in Christ, and so that's more important, right? Note, and I always find this kind of humorous, note that he then politely asked that Philemon not punish Onesimus. And then he kind of ends it with quite the guilt trip. So at Philemon 17 through 19, he says, "So if you consider me your partner, receive him as you would receive me," right? So that's pretty big, right? So, me, Paul, I'm saying that you should take him back as if it were me coming to you, right? That's pretty important. "If he has wronged you at all or owes you anything, charge that to my account," right? So he's like, look, you can blame me for anything that's happened, put it on me, and then he comes up and he says he'll take care of it, right? He says, "I, Paul, write this with my own hand," which again shows the importance of the matter. "I will repay it," right? So how nice of Paul to say, whatever it takes, I will repay it. "To say nothing of your owing me, even your own self," right? So notice he's like, basically, listen, if he owes you anything, just put it on my tab. And you do owe me your salvation. So I'm not going to bring that up, but just think, right? So, all right. Also in Philemon, in verses 1 and 2, it says, "Paul, a prisoner for Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother, to Philemon, our beloved fellow worker, and Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and the church in your house," right? And so note again, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but note that the early church met in houses, right? And so when we talk about the church at Ephesus or the church at wherever, we're talking about houses. We're not talking about, there's no church buildings, obviously, right? So note, to meet in a house, it would need to be a larger home, right? And so therefore you're talking about more affluent members of the Christian community that would have these house churches. And note that these larger homes would have a courtyard where you could receive people and talk to people and stuff. And so this is very likely where they would have these, sermons and such would be given, or they would have their services or whatever. And that's a fairly public space, right? Because it's outside, and so people would see that. And I'm not saying that you couldn't go in, right? And certainly when there was more, maybe more persecution, they could go in. But this is certainly an option that they're going to be outside sometimes. Certainly people are going to see them coming and going, right? And clearly people are going to know what's going on there. So that becomes important a little later on when we get to Paul's teachings about women and how they should act in services. But before we get to that, we're going to go to Philippians. And note in Philippians, as you read through, there's this interesting situation where there are some, let's call them flawed teachers, right? We don't want to call them false teachers because Paul doesn't call them that. And as we get toward the last of this passage that we're going to look at, he clearly doesn't see that they're necessarily false teachers. So at Philippians 1:15, he says, "Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill," right? And so note, you have two different groups preaching the gospel. You have the first group who's preaching out of envy and rivalry, right? And then you have the second group that's preaching out of goodwill. And he says, "The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel," right? So that second group he addresses first. They're preaching the gospel out of love, right? But then on verse 17, he says, "The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment," right? So note, group one is out of selfish ambition, and they're trying to afflict Paul. And so it would seem that they find some pride in being able to spread or preach the gospel when Paul is imprisoned, right? And so it's like they're one-upping Paul while he's in prison. So you would think Paul would be pretty unhappy about that, right? Because, they're one-upping me and I can't have that. But no, Paul does not see it that way at all. He finds it very interesting, actually. So at 1:18, he says, "What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. And in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice," right? And so the kicker is they're both spreading the gospel, right? And Paul's like, "I don't care. If they want to do it to spite me, go for it." They're still spreading the gospel, right? So I liken this unto preachers who fall, right? You see these stories of preachers who fall and everything. And, I always think of the old classic example, Jimmy Swaggart, right? And I'm not a fan of Jimmy Swaggart. And I really, honestly, I know he's a little more charismatic than Baptist, right? And so, but listen, apparently, I'm just assuming that Jimmy Swaggart preached the gospel. Again, he's a little before my time, but he had a pretty serious fall, right? However, does that take away from all the people who came to Christ under Jimmy Swaggart's teachings? No, it does not, right? Because listen, those people were saved by the gospel via the Holy Spirit, right? Jimmy Swaggart was just the vessel by which that happened, assuming that people came to faith via Jimmy Swaggart, and I'm sure that they did. The fact that he fell, however horrible that is, doesn't affect all those people, right? It's not like, let's say that I'm a police officer, right? And let's say in the last year, I've had 100 drug busts, right? Like I'm just like, bam, Johnny on the spot. Like I can spot the drugs, like nobody's business. However, it turns out on that 100th drug bust, I got busted on my body camera planting drugs in the car, right? So now we have a problem because I've had 99 other drug arrests that are all now completely put up for debate, did he really find drugs or did he plant the drugs or whatever happens, right? All of those arrests are now called into question. Well, that's not the same with the gospel. You come to Christ through the gospel itself. The vessel is always going to be imperfect, right? Now, obviously, some more imperfect than others. And listen, let me just say this. Some more publicly imperfect than others, right? And that's the problem, right? Everybody's imperfect. But sometimes, it becomes very public. And that, again, that's a terrible thing. And certainly we're not defending anybody who falls, right? But again, it doesn't call your salvation into question. Right? If you were saved by somebody 25 years ago, and then suddenly that person does something stupid, Well, you don't say, oh gosh, well, am I saved? I don't know. I don't know if that I am. Of course you are, right? Assuming you believe the things that you're supposed to believe, right? And so that's what Paul is basically saying. And I'm not even saying that these people have fallen, but their motivation for spreading the gospel is wrong. However, they're still spreading the gospel and people are still being saved. And Paul says, hey, good job, right? So what of these rivals at Philippi, right?
So,
Yeah.
Would that be similar to when the disciples tried to stop the others who were healing and casting out demons in Mark?
Yeah. I would say so, yeah. Absolutely, yes. Note, as we look at them, so were they false teachers, right, is the question. Well, note that they aren't Judaizers, right? The people who were following Paul and trying to tell people they had to follow the law and the circumcision and all that. Because at Galatians 1:6 and 1:7, Paul says, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. He calls that a different gospel. Not that there is another one. So he's saying, look, there's not another gospel, right? You're following a different gospel, and I'm telling you there's not two. There's only one, right? But there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. So these people aren't the Judaizers because he speaks pretty strongly about them. And it is unlikely that Paul would be pleased with the preaching of the false prophets as were in Corinth, which he described as in 2 Corinthians 11, 13, and 14. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Right? So note, he doesn't describe them that way, and he's happy with the gospel that they're teaching. It's that they have some personal issue with Paul, and they have their own faction, but their gospel, no matter how it's motivated, is still the gospel, right? And so Paul's happy with that. And it is precisely Paul's belief that God is working in his situation that allows him to come to terms with the preaching of his rivals, right? And so it's kind of like the gospel is being spread while he's in his captivity. And note, not only are other people spreading it, but he's spreading it within the household, right? Like of all the different people. He's basically, what's happened is he's under house arrest, and he's kind of moved from place to place for a while. And so, at one point, he's even chained to a guard, and he's like talking to the guard like, so what about Jesus? Have you ever heard of him? And it's like, literally, these guards are captive audiences. And he's like, hey, we're going to be here a while. Let's talk about Jesus, right? And so, and then you have people on the outside who are doing it. And even though they're doing it for the wrong reasons, they're still doing it. Note that in Philippians, Paul has a struggle between his desire for death versus his will to work, right? And so, he describes it as a real struggle. So at Philippians 1:21, he says, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain, right? So to live is Christ involves Paul's earthly ministry and complete devotion to Christ, right? In which he finds joy in that. He finds joy in spreading the gospel. However, to die is gain means that if Paul dies, then he gets to go and be with Christ, right? And so it's like, these are both viable options for him. And I will say, just as we go through, because it does seem, it seems odd that Paul would describe it this way, but listen, Paul's struggled, right? He's struggled. He's older at this point, and he is within just a couple of years, apparently, of his death, or by Nero. And so it's kind of like, obviously nobody wants to die, right? But let's say, God forbid, that, and I'll use myself as an example. Let's say that I have some like cancer or something, right? And I'm in severe pain all the time, and it's not going to get better, right? Well, I could certainly see myself coming to a point to where I would be like, you know what? I would rather be with Christ than to continue on in this manner where I'm suffering and people around me are suffering and all of that. I could see making the choice that I would just be with Christ, right? Waiting on my family and everything to be there with me then, right?
You really have to be sick.
Right, absolutely, right? Yes, absolutely. And so, do what? Yeah, right. So that's kind of what Paul's dealing with, right? Is that whole idea. So that's what he's explaining to them. So he says at 122, if I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell, right? So he's saying, listen, if I stay here on earth, I can continue to spread the gospel. But I don't know that that's what I want to do, right? I think that I might want to retire, all right? I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better, right? So that's what he really wants. He's like, listen, I really want to die and be with Christ and be done with all this. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account, right? So Paul, again, as he does throughout the letter of Philippians, he is modeling self-sacrifice. So the Philippians, that's what they need to learn. They need to learn love for each other and self-sacrifice. And so he's saying, listen, it would be far better for me to die and to be with Christ, having known full well and be completely comforted in the fact that I've done my job, right? Like there's nobody that's going to say, well, he just gave up. He didn't, finish the race, right? As Paul would describe it. Absolutely he did. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. And so what he's saying is, listen, you need me. And so despite the fact that I want to go and be with Christ, people here, particularly the Philippians in this case, they still need me. And so he's going to sacrifice his desire to be with Christ with his need to spread the gospel. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because my coming to you again. And so note that he believes that he will ultimately continue on in his ministry. Even though he's under house arrest, he believes that he's going to continue on, and he does. He apparently, we don't know for all the details, and it's not in Acts. After the events of Acts, Paul apparently gets out, and then he goes to Spain apparently, and according to tradition, and then he's rearrested under Nero, and Peter is also arrested under Nero, and then they're both martyred under Nero. Note, however, that in 2:17, as you read through, in 2:17, he certainly talks about the possibility of being martyred. So he doesn't feel like it's a guarantee that he's going to survive. But keep in mind, he's still spreading the gospel in house arrest, right? All right. The humble nature of the believer in Philippians 2:5 through 9, based on Christ. So at Philippians 2:5, it says, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, right? So listen, you need to be like this, Jesus, right? Like what? I need to be like Jesus? That's hard, all right? Who, though he was in the form of God, and note that the Greek behind that means in the very essence of God, is the same as God, right? Did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, right? So in other words, he came down to be human in order to self-sacrifice, right? Knowing that he was God, but he didn't play that trump card and say, you know what, I'm God, I don't have to do this, right? He can literally do whatever he wants, like literally, as no other being has ever been able to do before. He can do whatever he wants, and yet he chooses to come down and self-sacrifice. But emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So he humbled himself to be a human being in the first place, and then even as a human, he humbled himself even more. Like he could have been like, you know what would be awesome? I could go to earth and be like the coolest king ever and like win every war and like have all the pleasures of, like he literally could have done those things too, right? Like he can do whatever he wants, right? However, even when he comes into human form, humbling himself, then he humbles himself even in human terms to be the lowliest of humans, crucified on a cross, right? Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. So be like Christ, humble yourself, right? You might think that you're high and mighty, and you may try to lord it over other people or whatever. Maybe you're rich, or maybe you're the boss, or whatever it may be. But remember, Jesus was God, and he humbled himself as low as you could get, crucified on a cross. So therefore, maybe we as just normal humans could also humble ourselves, right? Now, let me just say, being like Jesus, that's a high bar, right? But should at least try. All right, Paul says at Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me, right? And this verse has been abused throughout the history of Christianity, right? So if I gotta clean the basement, I'm like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, right? Or I'm gonna run a race, And listen, I'm not saying that you can't find inspiration in verses like this, but let me just point out that it's not the original context, right? So let's look at the context, starting at Philippians 4:10. He says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. And what he's talking about, spoiler alert, is giving me money, right? He's like, I know that you didn't have the opportunity to give me any money, some financial support or whatever, and so you finally come around and you've been able to do that, right? Not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need, right? I can do all things through him who strengthens me, yet it was kind of you to share my trouble, right? And so note what he's doing is he is actually minimizing their gift, or at least his need for their gift, right? He's saying, I appreciate it and thank you so much, but just for the record, I didn't need it, right? I didn't ask you for it. It was unnecessary, but it's the thought that counts. It's kind of the opposite of the thought that counts, right? Like it was a good gift. And he's like, well, it's the thought that counts, But why is he acting this way, right? Well, Paul always acts that way throughout his letters because you have people who go around from church to church and they ask for money, right? And so that's their motivation, is to get money. And so Paul wants to make sure that nobody ever thinks that that's his motivation. And so he tries to go by without asking for money. And he even gets money for other people and takes it to, Jerusalem, for instance. And what does he do? He works, right? He works for his money so that nobody can go back and say, well, Paul's just trying to, get money from people. And so particularly, he could be mistaken for what we call a Cynic philosopher. The Cynics, right? It comes from Stoicism, right? And so note that Stoics are, they emotion is bad, right? Which I agree with. Emotion is bad. And they try not to have any emotions or any attachments to anything on earth, right? Now, I have those, obviously, right? And so that way, you don't get, there's nothing to be emotional about, right? If there's nothing that I care about, then there's nothing for me to get emotional about, right? And so that's the way Stoics saw it. And so Cynics, they come out of that, right? So they believed in living with the barest essentials, right? So if the more material items I have, that's bad, right? They were known for wearing ragged clothes and for begging. And they preached a philosophy of ethics, right? Which Paul does, right? He preaches a philosophy of ethics based on Jesus and love. But their language was abusive, and they saw their teaching as analogous to a surgeon cutting out gangrene, right? So it's like, we say, like, well, I just told him like it was, right? Like I didn't pull any punches. I just told him like it was, right? Well, that's what the Cynics did, right? They just came in and told you like it was, right? Lucian, who was a Greek satirist, he said this. He said, they collect tribute going from house to house, or as they themselves express it, they shear the sheep, right? Meaning they take from the people who, follow them or listen to them. And they expect many to give, either out of respect for their cloth or for fear of their abusive language, right? So it's like, just give them money. Don't I don't want to hear you anymore. Like, just please stop, right? So that's why, again, Paul doesn't want anybody to be able to say, he took our money. All right, James. So then we went to James. This may be the most books that we've covered at one time. All right, James on temptations. Note that at James 1, 2 through 4, he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." Right? Now, that's a hard deal to live with, right? Count it as joy when you meet trials of various kinds. "For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, right? And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Right? And so, look, the basic gist of this is they're suffering for Christianity, right? And so that's when you put up or shut up, right? Like, oh, I'm a Christian, and listen, when they get mad, whatever cause gets mad at Chick-fil-A, I'm going to go to Chick-fil-A and stand in a long line. Look at me, right? And so that's what we do, right? In the United States, right? Well, under real persecution, you have to make a real choice, right? When somebody has a gun to your head and they say, hey, denounce Christianity or I'm going to kill you, then at that point, you have a choice to make, right? And when you choose, I'm a Christian, right? Under those circumstances, even if you're dead at the end of it, you've passed the test, right? That's the point being made there, is that it's under persecution that your faith really shows, right? So then moving on at James 1, 12 through 13, we find a temptation, right? So those are trials. A temptation is a trial that leads to sin, right? So a trial, we're talking about the difference between a trial and temptation. Trials are things that test our faith, right? They just come up and they test our faith. A temptation is a trial that leads to sin, oftentimes blaming God as though he put us through a trial so that we would fail, right? So that's the point that James is making. So at James 1, 12 through 13, he said, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial," right? "For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." Again, speaking to Christians under persecution, right? "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one," right? Note that the crown of life that you get is the exact, like a laurel wreath, right? That's what you get when you win a Greek game or something. They give you a laurel wreath. That's what you get when you win in Christianity, right? Not literally, obviously, but he just compares it to that. Today, we would say you get a trophy, right? And so he goes on at 14 and 15. "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death," right? So note, it is our own desires that lead to temptations, right? Think addiction, right? And let me just say, whenever I talk about addiction, I always say, I'm not minimizing addiction, right? It's certainly, it's a thing, right? And, I always say, because of my OCD, I have to be very careful with things because I would be addicted to, all kinds of things, right? And so, so I'm careful, right, of that. But let's say that, for whatever reason you try, let's just say some drug, right? Or let's say it this way. Let's say that I am in I'm in an accident of some sort, right? And then of course, which there are lawsuits now and everything because of the overprescription of opiates and stuff. But let's say I'm prescribed pain pills, right? And then let's say that I really, really enjoy those pain pills. And so after I'm done with my actual hurt, I continue to take those pain pills, right? So now note that I am giving in to that temptation to continue to take those. And so then I start finding them other places, right? Because my doctor's not going to prescribe them anymore. So now I'm going to start looking for them other places and I'm going to find other avenues, right? Well, then eventually, if you if you know how that generally works, if you're stuck on opiates and pills and such, you generally will move to heroin if you stay on that. And so now I'm going looking for heroin and stuff, and you need more and more. And so now I'm spending our family money on drugs and such, which hurts my family. Obviously, the fact that I'm on drugs hurts my family. It's going to hurt my job. So then note, all of these things start falling apart because you're giving into these temptations, right? And so that's the point that he's making here, right? Is it's those temptations that cause evil to go on in your life. That's not God's fault. God didn't do those things to you. You did those things to yourself, right? That's the point. And again, I'm not minimizing the addiction, obviously, but it's that's the point of it, right? Alcoholism, same thing, right? Do not be deceived at verse 16. My beloved brothers, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be shall be a kind of first fruits of his creatures, right? So note that not only does God not want us to fail, James is saying, he's the one who gives us the strength to persevere even when we're being tempted, right? So note, even in, you join, what is it, right? Alcoholics Anonymous is, it's the 12-step program, right? And one of those is faith, right? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that is, right? And so that's the thing, is you lean on God because God gives you the necessities to be able to get past those struggles. And so that's what James is talking about. God is not tempting you to do evil. He is the one providing you with the tools necessary to get past that temptation, right? All right, James and the law. Note that there are books and books and books written about James and Paul and whether they differ on their teachings about Christianity and the law, or what we would call law and grace. So note that James seems to be, or you could construe him to be, condoning following the Mosaic law at James 2, 8 through 12. And note again that James is the more conservative when it comes to Judaism, right? And he's the one that in Acts 15, he makes the decision, the official decision, that the Gentiles do not have to follow the Mosaic law and all of that. But he's the one who at the beginning, remember Peter was even embarrassed to eat with Gentiles when James was around, right? Because James was like, we're not supposed to be doing that kind of stuff. And then it all comes to a head, right? A fairly contentious situation. So at James 2, 8 through 12, he says, if you really fulfill the royal law, according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. And that's the key, just for the record. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's the key. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. He keeps talking about the law, right? For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. For he who said, do not commit adultery, obviously from the law, also said, do not murder. If you do not commit adultery but do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty, right? And so note, to understand what he's talking about, you have to go back and look at that first section, right? And this is what happens when we take things out of context. So starting at 1 through 7, he says, my brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at my feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you, and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? So note, James, going into that next section that we read before, James is not talking about the Mosaic law. He is talking about the new covenant law, right? Which he refers to as the implanted word, or the word planted in you, at James 1:21, where he says, therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. And that word is implanted in your heart. So he's talking about the new covenant before all of this, and it's in that context, right? But how can we define this new covenant law that he's talking about? Well, Matthew 22:37 through 40, it says, and he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. And so again, what does the New Testament covenant look like? It looks like loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself, right? So again, James continues after describing the poor treatment of the poor among the brethren with verse 8, where he says, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. And so that's what he sets up this whole conversation about the law, is he's talking about, again, the law of love, which is what Paul teaches and what Jesus teaches, and James is teaching it here. It's the same thing. He does certainly go into talking about other aspects of the law, but he's saying, look, if you can't get those things right, then you fail everything, right? And note again that we've talked about this in the past. If you get love your neighbor and love God, then everything else will fall into place, right? There's no reason to even worry about the law if you have those things going for you, right? Because you're not going to do all of those things. You're not going to break any of the other parts of the law. So then you have 1 Timothy, right? So then we move into 1 Timothy. I feel like we're on tour of the several books. And so you have Paul on the law, right? So at 1 Timothy 1, 5 through 7, it says the aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and a good faith conscience and a sincere faith. And a good conscience and a sincere faith. I think I said good faith, conscience, and a sincere faith. Whatever. I'm adding to the word of God, right? Certain persons, by swerving from these, have wandered away into vain discussion, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. Right? So in 1 Timothy, you have apparently false teachers who have some sort of fascination with the Mosaic law, right? And so Paul is saying, why are they even worried about it? Like, love is what you should be worried about. All this other stuff, like, we've been past that, right? We're not going back and retracing these steps again. So then at 1:8 through 11, he says, now we know that the law is good, right? Whoa, wait, what? If one uses it lawfully. Understanding this, the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted, right? So note, he says, hey, the law is good if used correctly. And who is it for? All of these horrible people who don't have Christ, right? Those people need the law, right? So he's arguing that here that the Mosaic law is there for people whose hearts aren't right with God. So they need strict guidelines to know right from wrong. In Christ, we know right from wrong, right? So we don't need the law anymore because we automatically should want to do the right thing in every situation, right? Think of it in terms of a parent or a babysitter, right? When you are younger and you can't take care of yourself, you need a parent or a babysitter to help keep you on track, both physically and ethically, right? When you grow up, most people no longer need a babysitter or a parent to tell them right from wrong and to keep them from, hurting themselves and such, right? However, we still have those people who don't seem to get it, right? And so those people end up in prison, right? So that's what the laws are for, is so that to keep people who are inclined to do wrong on the right track, right? And that's what Paul is talking about through all of that, right? That's why he says the law is good, but it's only good for people who aren't right with God and they need these extra guidelines. That's the deal. Once you get right with God, you shouldn't need those guidelines. Paul and women in the church. At 1 Timothy 2, starting at 8. Note that men are causing disruption through their carrying over of anger in the services, right? So for whatever reason, I guess they might be fighting or whatever, and then they go into the service and they're like, it's not holy hands they're raising up, right? It's angry hands. So at 1 Timothy 2:8, he says, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling, right? So he speaks of the men who are doing something wrong, right? Who are having problems in the worship service. Then he moves on to women who are also causing disruption by their dress, starting out. He says, likewise, also, that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. So remember what we said earlier about worship in house churches that could spill over into the courtyard, right? So this would be a publicly visible worship service, right? Potentially. Regardless, these women are going to be associated with Christianity. And in Roman society at this time, you had what was called the new woman, right? And they flaunted their sexuality and traditional Roman family values, right? And so this is a problem again. And listen, it's a problem enough now when you see people flaunting traditional values or whatever. But if it could make them kill you, then obviously that would be a problem. Think of it more along the lines of the strictest of Muslim countries where they practice Sharia law. You don't generally see women flaunting those traditional values, right? So that would be a problem, right? And so here you have a similar idea. You have these women who are flaunting traditional values, and Paul is like, you can't be doing that kind of stuff, right? Paul is already in prison because of persecution of Christianity. And so the last thing we need is to bring down Roman officials on us even more and think that Christianity is promoting all kinds of, bucking the system when it comes to traditional family values, as we would call it, right? And again, we've already talked about how Christians were already accused of crazy things like eating human flesh, right? So they were accused of cannibalism. They had all kinds of sexual situations that they were accused of. And so we're trying to minimize that, right? Because we don't want persecution from Rome. So y'all are coming from this new woman stuff. We can't be playing those games, right? Because you're going to get us in trouble. So then it moves on to 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Note, though, that Adam was standing right with her when she was deceived, right? So it's like, and that's part of the problem here, is that Adam did not give her sufficient information for her not to be deceived, right? Because what? She's confused about when the serpent says, hey, did God say that you could not eat from any tree in the Garden of Eden? And she says, oh no, we can't eat from the garden of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, nor can we touch it. Well, God didn't say that, right? God didn't say that at all. And so, so she didn't have all the information, right? So then it says, even stranger, yet she will be saved through childbearing, right? If they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So note that the cult of Artemis, active in Ephesus, right, where this letter is,
The cult of what?
Artemis, Artemis, it exalted the woman over a man, right? And Gentile Christian women would have likely been involved to some degree with the worship of Artemis. And then you have these new women who are wives, and no, these are wives, these are married women, right? The new woman is a married woman, right? So it's basically like, look, men can have all the affairs they want, right? Because listen, it's not the affair that really matters so much. We're talking about in Roman society, right? Not in Jewish society, it would be a big deal, right? Even though, in all fairness, Jewish men also had affairs. But if a man has an affair, according to the Roman society, it doesn't affect anything negatively because there's no ultimate problem after the fact. If a woman has an affair, that puts in doubt the parentage of the child, right? So if there's a male child born and we don't know who the father is, that's a problem, right? And so that's the problem with having affairs and such. They really didn't have a problem with just general affairs if it didn't have any negative consequences, right? So these new women, they began to explore greater sexual and social freedoms, right? And they were pushing back against these traditional Greco-Roman wifely roles where the wife was always quiet and submissive and in the background, right? So you have those two things working against women in Christianity, right? Because this is where these women are coming from. They're Gentile Christians, so they're coming from this whole worldview. So it was Eve who was deceived because she did not have all the information concerning how the tree of the knowledge of good and evil should be handled, right? So that we should touch it or not. These women who are stirring up controversy are emboldened by their new women status or their new woman status and their previous worship practices, right? So therefore they need to remain silent and learn. And note that Paul states that they need to learn, which right there is revolutionary because normally women would not be allowed to learn, right? And so that's pretty revolutionary that they're expected to learn. They also seem to be taken in by these false teachers, right? And so they're not getting all the information because there's these false teachers, and so they don't understand. And so that's causing apparently conflict. Because listen, even in the Baptist church, we certainly don't expect women to be silent in church, right? Like at the very least, we don't expect that. We think, oh, clearly there's something more going on, right? So there's a lot going on here that you just don't get from reading it, right? I mean, in other places, Paul has women prophesying in the church, which means they're standing up, giving a word from God in the middle of the church service, right? So, I mean, okay. Okay. Note that the point about being saved through childbearing, which is kind of, is that these women who are being taken in by all kinds of negative outside influences, right? Whether it be the worship of Artemis, this new woman status, these false teachers, they've just got a lot going on, right? Note that they should return in safety to their traditional female roles. And so again, y'all are bringing down all of this negative vibes from the Roman government. You got to chill out and just calm down, learn about Christianity, your new faith, right? And just don't rock the boat because there's a problem. All right, 1 Timothy 3:2 says, therefore an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, and it goes on, right? Note that this is misunderstood sometimes, right? And listen, whatever you think about divorce and all of that, obviously, listen, let me just say, obviously, you don't want to get divorced, right? The ultimate goal would be to find your spouse and stay married and then always be married. But clearly things happen, right? I mean, there's stuff that happens, and sometimes you can't help that. This passage is not about being divorced. It has nothing to do with divorce. What this is saying is, in a world where it is accepted for a man to have concubines and have affairs, you can't be doing that if you're a Christian, right? And certainly if you're going to be a leader in the church, you can't be doing those things, right? That's the point. If we take it out of its context, and again, I mean, whatever Paul would have thought about divorce or whatever, it's just this is not speaking about it, right? And so when we talk about being the husband of one wife, it's about those things, infidelity and such as that. It's not about, my wife tried to kill me, but gosh, I've got to stay with her because, Paul says I can't, get divorced, right? Or I can't serve in the church or whatever. Yeah, right? Yeah, I really like being a deacon, and, I'll just have to sleep in another room with the door locked, right? Whatever. That is not what's going on here, right? And I think we've had some misunderstanding on that. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know. I want to say that there's been some misunderstanding even in our own bylaws about that, right? It's not about divorce. There's been some discussion about whether a deacon could be divorced or not and remarried or whatever. I'm just saying, I'm not saying you should one way or the other on that, but I'm just saying that's not what this is talking about. Right? This is not talking about just being divorced and remarried or anything like that. All right, remember when we talked about the mystery in Ephesians? Wow, we are running out of time. And in that case, the mystery was that the Gentiles were let in. Well, note in 1 Timothy 3:16, he says, "Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory," right? And so there, the mystery that Paul talks about has to do with God being divine, right? God in the flesh. And note that angels witnessed both his resurrection because they were at the tomb and his ascension when he ascends in Acts 1:10. There are two angels that are standing there when he ascends, right? And so that's what that seems to be talking about. All right, Paul on the pitfalls of money. Note that, oh yeah, we're close. Note that at 1 Timothy 6:6-10, Paul says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare." Note that whole idea about temptation again. If you have a lot of money, that is a temptation. Just like if you're taking drugs, like if I'm taking prescribed drugs, that could be a temptation as well. It's the same type of thing. The Bible is not teaching, both Jesus and Paul here, they're not saying that it's not okay to have money or lots of money or to be rich, right? There's lots of rich people in the Bible. The problem is that it does create a temptation. And so your goal would be to use your money for good, right? So that it doesn't become a temptation to you. But it's not saying that you can't have money, and it's not even saying that you can't have things, right? Which now let me just say, if you have things, what's the problem? If you start putting all your faith in your things, then again, boom, you've sinned because of that temptation that the money provides for you. That's the deal. And so note that Paul says at 6:10, "For the love of money," note it is the love of money that is a root of all kinds of evils. And listen, you see this in rock stars, actors, sports figures, all of that type of stuff. Even mega pastors, right? You see mega pastors who get popular, they get a bunch of money, and then they have some spectacular fall where it turns out this money has gone to their head and all of that. And so that's the point, is it's not, again, about having a lot of money. It's about how you use that money and whether it becomes a temptation to you in a negative way. Temptations are negative. Trials aren't. Temptations are. And then last, notice 2 Timothy, and we're just going to do one verse. 2 Timothy 3:1 says, "But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty." Right? And so again, note that here he's telling them that their times are going to be difficult in the last days, right? So what are we talking about? Are we talking about only some future time that's completely foreign to them where suddenly things will get bad? No. We, again, are living in the last days now. And those people were living in the last days then because we've all been living in the last days since Jesus, right? Those are the last days, right? And so that's what we're talking about. If I'm not mistaken, next week we will get even more into that a little bit, where there's this whole idea of Jesus is coming soon, right? And this is obviously in the first century, and unless you consider over 2,000 years soon, that's not the deal. So look, they always taught in the first century, and listen, throughout history, you always teach that Jesus could come back at any moment, right? And you got to be ready, right? And so in the book of Revelation, it talks about the time being near, and that kind of has the nuance of quickly, right? So yes, I could look back and I could say statistically, Jesus hasn't been back in the last 2,000 years. He's not going to come back in my life, right? It is very unlikely Jesus is going to come back in any of our lifetimes, just statistically, right? However, if I just think, oh, well, so therefore I have all this time that I can just do whatever I want, and then, before I die, I'll decide, then what I want to do about Jesus or Christianity or whatever. Well, that's a problem, because I may not live till tomorrow, right? I might get hit by a train or something, right? Whatever. And so you always look at it as though Jesus could come back at any moment, because it's about being prepared at all times. Don't put it off, right? Your salvation. Go ahead and make that decision now, because again, we don't know what'll happen. Jesus may not come back in my lifetime, but I might go meet Jesus, right? Suddenly. And, we don't always get that choice to decide at the last minute, like you're walking across the street and then you slow motion, they say your life goes before you, and you see the car coming, and then suddenly you're like, wait a minute, let's take this moment. Jesus, I accept you. I would like to be in heaven after this car hits me, right? It's just not the way it works, right? So you should always be prepared as though Jesus is going to return at any moment, or again, statistically more likely that you're suddenly going to meet Jesus at any moment, right? That's the point. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.